I can remember the exact moment. I was 6 years old, and that goes back to 1929. I was sitting in the armchair in my old home at East Grinstead in Sussex. My mother was a bit interested in astronomy. I don't mean wildly so, but enough to have one or two little books. And in the bookshelf, I pulled out a book called The Story of the Solar System by G.F. Chambers, published 1898, price sixpence. It wasn't actually a boy's book, it was an adult book, but my reading was all right. And I curled up in the chair, and I wouldn't be pulled out until I'd finished it. And I decided this was interesting and should be pushed along, and it simply began then.
And what did that book tell you that excited you so much?
Difficult to say. It was a book about the moon, the sun, and the planets, and I just thought this was interesting. So when darkness fell, I went outdoors and looked up. There are the stars, wondered what they are, and that's it. It just went on from there.
And when did you first get a telescope? Because obviously, with the naked eye, it's very difficult to actually look at anything in great detail.
I did the right thing. I managed to borrow a pair of binoculars. And, of course, binoculars, to start with, are far better than a very small telescope. I didn't know that then, but I knew it now. In fact, I bought a pair of binoculars, looked round, and then I started saving up for a telescope. By the time I was just over 10, I'd accumulated the wonderful sum of £7 10 shillings, which in those days was a good deal. And with that, I bought a 3-inch telescope, which I still have and which I still use. It was a beauty. I looked at the moon through this telescope. I saw the mountains, the craters, and this is a weird world, a wonderful kind of world. And my fascination with the moon began at that moment. I actually published my first paper on lunar research when I was 13.
What sort of academic study have you done over the years?
My own particular research in astronomy had been on lunar cartography. I was mapping the moon. I remember the Russians used all my moon maps in 1959 when they sent their first unmanned probe round the far side, and they used all my stuff then. The Americans used it too, and they did a lot of my mapping, partly in my own observatory, and partly at the Lowell Observatory at Flagstaff in Arizona, and partly in Paris. So I did a lot of lunar cartography. Mind you, the work I was doing then is now, to all intents and purposes, obsolete, because nowadays you use space stuff. But in those days there weren't any spacecraft, not when I started, and the work then had to be done. So although we knew it would be obsolete, it had to be done at the time.
When did you first get your observatory at home?
After the war, you see, my education was decidedly upset by illness. From the age of 6 to 16, I'm in and out of bed the whole time. Passed Commonwealth for public school, never got there. Managed to get all my usual school degrees. Then, of course, the war broke out, and I was 16 years old, and I had my Cambridge entrance. But I must admit that since I had a certain problem with the medical, a slightly cocked heart, I knew that passing the medical for the forces was going to be a problem. So I had to fiddle my age and fiddle the medical, which I did, and I got in and flew, and that really upset things there. So and I emerged from the RAF finally, right at the end of the war, after everything was over, and I set up my first observatory then with a 12.5-inch reflector, which again I still have.
Obviously, very difficult to keep up any sky watching during the war, of course.
Well, quite impossible. I mean, I was far too busy.
So much stuff going on in the sky as well.
Well, because I was an RAF navigator, so I was far too busy.
Was that an interesting time for you as well, being able to get involved in the RAF? Was that something you always wanted to do?
Not in the slightest. But for the war, I would have gone nowhere near the forces. I'm the very reverse of service-minded, but when the war broke out, I obviously didn't want to stay at home. And frankly, if I'd gone into the Army or the Navy, I'd have lasted 10 minutes, and I knew that. Therefore, the thing I thought I could do was to fly, so I fiddled my way in.
And when did the broadcasting and the writing begin in a proper sense?
Writing began at a very early age. I'd published 1 or 2 papers on lunar research even before the war when I was a teenager. And the first thing ever came out in book form under my own name was not very long after the war, must have been 1946. Gérard de Vaucouleurs, the French astronomer, who's now dead very sadly, he'd written a book about Mars and didn't speak English. He did later, he didn't then, and said, would I translate it for him? So I did. So the first thing that came out in book form was a translation of de Vaucouleurs' book. Then I wrote my own book, Guide to the Moon, as I was asked, and I went on from there. And the broadcasting and television actually began in 1957. And it was the BBC's idea, not mine. Paul Johnstone, the television producer, had the idea of doing a programme about astronomy on a regular basis that hadn't been done before. He wasn't himself an astronomer. He was an archaeologist, so he was a scientist in that respect, and thought that an astronomy programme would be rather a good idea. And he'd read a book or two of mine and thought, well, this might be someone to do it. So they rang me up and said, would you like to have a go? I said, what a good idea. I went and saw them, and we worked out the first Sky at Night programme. Going to be called Star Map originally, and we changed it before the first programme. And the BBC said, right, we'll put it on the air once every 4 weeks for 3 months and see how it went.
You've seen a fair few things happen in that time as well.
Don't forget, when I began doing Sky at Night in April 1957, there were no spacecraft. The space age didn't begin until the 4th of October 1957, when up went the first Russian satellite, Sputnik 1, and the space age began then. So I go back a long way.
Now, in Leicester, we're very well blessed with space research for this country. We have an excellent department at the university.
One of the leaders in the world, no question about it.
Absolutely, and hopefully it will develop and go from strength to strength in the future. You're being honoured by the university with an honorary degree. Is that something that you're quite proud of?
I'm very proud of it indeed, particularly from Leicester, because after all, when it comes to space astronomy, Leicester is one of the leading organisations in the entire world, right up with all the world leaders. So I feel very honoured indeed that they're giving me this degree.